I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to find order in our mad world. And we also sometimes talk about the difficulties Jason has navigating life in the UK, especially when it comes to car insurance.
Oh man, what a mad world. You know, when I bought the car and I finally figured out how to insure it, I was told by the car dealer that I could trade it in because the Apple CarPlay and the navigation doesn't work. He comes back to me with a better car that's cheaper so I can trade in and get money back. But the insurance doesn't have the registration plates and they won't accept the model, and they say there is no Opel Corsa built in that year and there is no whatever. So it's physically impossible to insure this car, and it's just a bureaucratic error, as it were, rather than some structural policy.
Jason, I'm really sorry to hear you're still wrangling with the bureaucracy of car insurance. But, dear listeners, for those of you who love Bridgerton, dear listeners, we are going to take you on a journey in this episode of the UK elections. We're going to be delving into this not so much explicitly on what the elections mean for the UK, but what it means for the UK's positioning in the world. What will it mean for our relationships with the EU? What will it mean for our relationships with the US? And whether, in fact, the possible change of government in the UK and a Keir Starmer-led government, which is what the polls are pointing to, might mean in terms of having a ripple effect across the G7 countries, having a kind of counter-narrative to the view that right-wing populism is just inexorably spreading.
Alex, what a disordering election campaign it's shaping out to be. From Farage saying that he wouldn't run, to then leading the Reform Party, experiencing a massive surge, announcing his wildly uncosted contract with Britain, and then, more recently, putting his foot in it by questioning if the West provoked Putin to invade Ukraine, and seeing his poll numbers drop. I still think Reform is going to do impressively, but it's nice to see that there are some issues that don't poll well with the British public. In other words, it's not like a hard right, anti-immigrant, pro-Putin, anti-woke agenda will always poll well. There are some things that he can say wrong, but I have an observation that I want to know how you're seeing things on. What I'm seeing talking to people here and watching BBC and ITV, which is that the right is setting the agenda of the election. In other words, what's being debated. Obviously, the right isn't doing well in the polls, and they're not going to win the election. But the themes that I see in the debates and the newspapers are taxes, immigration, and transgender. And when I'm talking to people, shockingly, 3 of my closest friends have told me that they're not going to vote for the major parties. And they have parroted back to me, and I'm not making fun of them, but they've parroted back to me things about transgender and taxes and immigration. And I'm thinking, this is because this is the right shaping the terrain of the election. What do you think, Alex?
So, yes, I think it's really interesting that the debate is centering on the kind of issues that Farage and the Reform Party are highlighting. And I think there are a number of reasons for it. One is that a lot of our main media is captured by the right wing. Secondly, the debate is also about what's happened in the Conservative Party and the future of the Conservative Party. Did Brexit fail because it was an awful idea, badly implemented, or was it a good idea, badly implemented? And then the third thing is that what happens to the Conservative Party after the election, assuming it gets a hefty walloping, how does the Conservative Party go into the future? Is it going to tack to the centre and have a more traditional one nation Tory future leader? Or is it going to be effectively taken over by Farage and the Reform Party wing and merge with them? or absorb Farage back into it and take on some of the ideas from the Reform Party. So I think part of the reason why so much is dominated by this are those three factors. I think people are assuming Labour is going to win. And so the real issue is what happens on the right. How well do Reform do? And do the Conservatives try and move even further to the right wing as a result of this? Now, your friends who've said they are not attracted by either of the main two parties, I'm afraid I'm a little bit in that camp myself. I mean, I strongly support Starmer as a future Prime Minister. I hope they get a decent majority. I want them to lead a strong government. But it is the case that both the two main parties are campaigning on a conspiracy of silence on the extent of the financial hole the UK is currently in. Their proposals aren't fully costed. They're both being pretty evasive about the taxes and the prospects for growth and where all the magic money is going to come to pay for new dental appointments, new hospital appointments, new teachers. I do think that the Labour Party's proposals are far more realistic and costed, but they're pretty modest. And the Institute for Financial Studies recently said there's still a little bit of a conspiracy of silence about where the money is going to come from. And Labour is saying, well, we're going to deliver growth. But then there's a conspiracy of silence about Brexit and the drag impact of Brexit on growth.
Alex, if I could have a tuppence for every time I have heard the word IFS in the last week, I would be a wealthy man. And yes, you mentioned the big daddy of them all when it comes to the conspiracy of silence, and that's the B word. If you watch the ITV debate as well as the leaders' interviews, Sunak and Starmer don't mention the B word. I have a new joke. Hear no Brexit, see no Brexit. They literally don't want to talk about it. And I can understand being attracted to the SNP or the Lib Dems because they're willing to discuss Brexit. They're willing to discuss Brexit fallout, and they're willing to discuss the need to have some regulatory alignment with the EU. I don't fully get it. Like, one of the things that's been hitting me, in addition to the non-understanding of the British car insurance system, I don't understand why Starmer can't more guide the agenda. Do you know what I mean? If he is going to get an 80 to 120 seat majority, if he sees that Sunak is attacking him in a debate, you're going to raise taxes by £2,000 per family, you're going to this, you're going to that. Why doesn't he reshape the debate by saying, in your 14 years in power, when you guys left the EU, you caused these and these costs. In addition to decreasing NHS waiting lists and going after migrant trafficking gangs, I'm going to increase trade by doing this, 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 and this. Why is it, Alex, that he simply cannot articulate what his policy towards the EU will be?
Why would Labour risk rocking the boat right now? They are comfortably ahead in the polls. They don't want to scare away their voters, and they are trying to win back to the Labour fold a lot of the red wall voters who backed Boris Johnson in 2019, who voted for Brexit. And they don't want to tell people that you made a mistake voting for Brexit. They would much rather run on the narrative about you were misled about how easy it was going to be to do and it was badly implemented. That's a safer narrative for them. So the point is that Starmer, he just has to not make any mistakes between now and next week. So I think his campaign's been quite dull. I think their manifesto is pretty safe. They're not sketching out a radically new, exciting, inspiring vision like Tony Blair did in 1997, where there was real excitement. There was a real sense of something different being on offer from the very tired, outgoing Conservative government. But Starmer is effectively pitching on, we're going to manage migration better. We're going to manage Brexit better. We're going to manage the economy better. We're going to be slightly better than you in all these areas. It's a very safe, dull agenda. I wish he was offering something a little bit more spicy, but right now they're ahead in the polls. It's like, let the Conservatives and Reform battle it out. They're just trying not to rock the boat.
100%.
Any openings.
Starmer is channeling Gareth Southgate in thinking if we just get all these draws, we can get through to the next round because we're ahead in our group. And
that's a good analogy.
I don't think Starmer has to be that boring, and I personally find him charismatic. But I ran into a Labour MP candidate earlier today on the street here in Hampstead. You know, I pushed her on some issues, and she's like, oh, it's very complicated, and that's a very nuanced issue, and I'll whatever. And I realized it must be coming down from Liberals Central that they have to be so safe because they're doing the Southgate strategy. We're ahead in the group, so if we just don't screw up, we're going to win. We're going to get through. I have to say that this makes me feel less so excited that I just can't hide it, because I thought he would lean in. He would say, this is me. I am going to really attack those migrant gangs, and I'm going to grow the economy, and I'm going to do the green jobs and whatever. And he's done some of that. But you're right that there is just a sense of so much caution that what I'm seeing on the doorstep is people are like, you know what? I'm not inspired enough. I think I will pull the lever for the Lib Dems or the Greens or the SNP, or in some cases, I'll use Tory or Reform as a protest vote. And I am not going to lay money that they're going to come in on more than 100 or 150 seat majority, because I think that they should be there, but he hasn't tried to hit a home run with this. You know, he's like, all we need to do is get a single and push the runner around the bases and we'll win the game. So it doesn't matter that this is the easiest pitch in British political history. Do you know what I mean? An 80-year-old cripple could take her cane and knock it out of the park, and he's bunting. I don't get that.
Yes, for English listeners, a bunt is where you tap the ball from the home plate. You just hit it like 2 or 3 feet and then run like crazy to first base rather than trying to hit it out of the ballpark. It's a very safe play and done well. It can help move runners around the bases. In fact, my son hit a very good bunt only on his last baseball game. It was a sacrifice bunt. He then got out at first base, but it was enough to move runners into scoring position. So he did what he was required. It does feel a little too safe. I mean, from my perspective, I have a lot of respect for Starmer, and I think he will be a fine Prime Minister. However, I do feel he's boxed himself in. He's spent a lot of time saying what he won't do, and he's allowed himself to be put on the defensive on issues like taxes. And it's just monstrous when you look at the financial catastrophe the UK is in after 14 years of Conservative rule. Starmer could have been way tougher on them. If I was in his shoes, I would be mentioning Partygate, MP scandals, corruption, association with Russian oligarchs, ennoblement of the sons of Russian spies to the House of Lords, to crony contracts, to saying let the bodies pile up in their thousands over COVID. I mean, there is so much he could be gunning. The incompetence of Truss, the turnover in ministers and prime ministers, 6 education secretaries, something like 12 housing secretaries of state in the last few years. I would be hammering the Conservatives. And it does look to me like Starmer is playing a defensive game. So I'm voting Lib Dem in this election. And I'm doing it for 2 reasons. One is in my constituency. It's a very safe Conservative constituency in Hampshire. And the only viable alternative is Lib Dem. I still don't think the Conservative is going to lose. This is a really true blue constituency, but the most viable alternative is a Lib Dem candidate. The second issue is that I would love it if the Lib Dems managed to push the Conservatives into third place, and actually the Lib Dems were the main opposition, because I feel that then sends a message also to the EU that actually the Conservative and reform narrative on Brexit is actually being pushed out of British politics. If reform, heaven forbid, does really well, and then Labour does maybe in a second term approach the EU and say, we want to start rebuilding relations, the EU is going to look and say, but look at how well reform did. So I think having the Lib Dems be the opposition would be really good. And then thirdly, I just like more elements of the Lib Dem manifesto. I feel they've been more outspoken.
For sure.
Explicit on issues that matter to me. However, for everybody listening, I still think vote tactically is the most important thing of all. Get the Tories out.
100%. I want to talk, though, a little bit about rejoin issues and ECJ jurisdiction and the ECHR. There may be a degree of toxicity in some parts of the electorate to hear these European acronyms floated again. But I am wondering if we could have some stealth mega ordering from Starmer. What would that mean? So he gets in with this 80 to 120 seat majority. And then there's some economic thing that happens. It's a bit of a crisis. And he says, you know what? We're going to enter into a Norway or a Switzerland style arrangement because this will boost the economy by that 1% to 2%. And it's going to get freedom of movement back so that we can get the workers that we need so we can do the 40,000 new NHS appointments per week and handle the social care crisis and blah, 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 blah. So I'm looking forward to what I call stealth mega ordering that Starmer can do only when he's in number 10. Obviously, it's not going to be rejoin. It's not going to be a second referendum, but it could be something with a tiny bit of a twist that boosts the British economy and does something that when people were voting leave in 2016, I think they always anticipated that the 5 freedoms would still be in play and that the economic relationship between Europe and Britain wouldn't be harmed. They were voting on sovereignty issues for the most part. So do you, as someone who tracks this EU issue, see those things as possible?
No, I don't, actually, for 2 reasons. One is that Starmer and his party has campaigned absolutely explicitly on ruling out going that far in rebuilding cooperation with the EU. So to go back on that immediately after they get, or within 1 or 2 years after getting into number 10, I think really serves to discredit British politics and will widen his party to very vicious attacks from the right-wing media. I think it will enhance distrust in politics. And secondly, because I don't think the EU will be in a position to agree to those things within that time scale. I think it takes a longer time to rebuild the groundwork for that, and especially since European politics is going to go through a bit of churn with the elections in France and the impact of the European Parliament elections. And thirdly, Starmer has laid out already quite a few ambitious plans that even themselves will take a little bit of time to negotiate with the EU. For example, trying to seek alignment on the chemical directive of the EU so that we can transport chemicals easier across our border, veterinary alignment, alignment on food and animal standards, mutual recognition of professional qualifications, some kind of limited mobility scheme. Those are all quite good things to try and achieve, but even those will require accepting the jurisdiction of the ECJ. in a very limited way. And that will immediately lead to howls of outrage from the Daily Mail and the Daily Express. So he's going to have to tread quite carefully. However, if he manages to achieve those things and they start producing results, what I'm hoping is that different sectors of the British business community will say, well, actually, we'd quite like that for our sector. And we'd quite like that mobility scheme to be extended to 35-year-olds, not just to the 15 to 25-year-olds. And there will be a demand. There will be, the sky hasn't fallen in on our heads. Actually, it started to produce some results. And then for his second term in office, he can campaign on the basis of responding to increasing popular demand for more in that direction. But I think he set himself a limited set of goals now. They hopefully will produce some results and they won't lead to too much of a backlash.
So what you're saying is that Sir Keir can't do the stealth mega ordering that is my wet dream, but he can do stealth micro ordering. And if he starts with some stealth micro ordering, then people can say, building on the success of our veterinary scheme, I bring you Erasmus Plus. Building on the success of Erasmus Plus, if I get another 5 more years, I might set our sights so high as to include free trade in the fisheries sector.
Exactly. You're making me sound quite excited now. That's very exciting. You can't see this, listeners, but Jason is waving his hands around and his hair is standing up on his head even more than usual. The issue, I think, is that from the EU side, they're going to be navigating some very difficult politics as a result of the EU elections and possibly a shock result in the French elections. Secondly, there will be a perspective on the EU side that the current arrangements, which overwhelmingly benefit EU producers vis-à-vis the UK, they're actually quite happy with some of these current arrangements. And thirdly, if Starmer asks for too much, they will say this is the kind of cherry picking that we actually can't allow. You're trying to have your cake and eat it, be outside the EU, and then start cherry picking the bits that you want. And there'll be a price to pay for that. And if we give you too much, I mean, we're not going to do this just as a favour to you. There will have to be some associated commitments or reciprocal things that we want. So this won't be straightforward. But I do think that's the way. I mean, imagine if he reintroduces a youth mobility scheme and you are a family of 4 travelling to the EU and you get to the customs and passport control line in France and your 2 teenagers go through in an accelerated process and you're in the slow lane waiting 4 hours to get agreement to go through, you're going to be like, bloody hell. Why am I stuck in the slow lane? Why can't we have this mobility that we used to have? So I think there will be increasing popular demand. And then Starmer can respond to that. And the trends are moving that way. But he can't jump ahead now.
Okay. This is a very compelling argument. His messianism must be non-messianic. He has to lead so slowly and incrementally, building on and consolidating in a centrist way from what is available to him.
Well, that's enough from me and you, Jason, on the EU aspects of this. After the break, dear listeners, we're going to come back and talk about it, what might mean for UK relations with the US.
Before we delve into how the different British parties are positioning themselves to interact with a second Biden administration or second Trump administration, I'm really interested in your read on how the British election is viewed in Washington. I know that in the States, John Sweeney's manifesto pledges are clearly covered in the front pages every day in the Wall Street Journal, and that every time Ed Davey falls off a paddleboard, they send New York Times reporters out there. I mean, obviously I joke, but we're going to put a link in the show notes to a New York Times story about the fact that Jeremy Hunt might lose his seat. That's a big deal. And people in the States are going to get that if a sitting chancellor in a safe seat in Surrey might lose his seat, that's like a pretty big deal. So I think that the mainstream American media has cottoned on to seismic shifts. But how would you say that the UK election is reverberating in DC rather than just the horse race aspect of it?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is the verb you choose, reverberating. It's not. People just aren't that interested in the UK. We have dropped off the radar screen. The stories that get picked up are the D-Day story did cut through, that Rishi Sunak cut D-Day. The catastrophe of Liz Truss cut through here. The chaos of the Johnson years cut through. Royal family stuff cuts through. I see virtually nothing about Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. He's just not a known figure. And I think to the extent that people are interested, if they're aware at all that there is an election going on in the UK, I think they will see it in the broader context of elections across the EU and in the context of their own domestic US election. I think the analysis is that it is interesting that when there appear to be shifts towards the right across continental Europe, as reflected in the European Parliament elections, and as we may see playing out in the French elections if the Marine Le Pen's party does well, the analysis will be the UK, having flirted with this right-wing nonsense for the last few years, has actually shifted back to the centre by electing Keir Starmer. So I think they will put it in that context, but there's not that much interest in actually who or what Keir Starmer per se is. He doesn't have a profile here. And then the second issue will be, what does it mean for UK-US elections? And I will flip the question back to you. Obviously, Starmer is more aligned with a kind of Biden worldview and is completely antithetical to a kind of Trump worldview. So that will be the second analysis. But I will flip it back to you because you're the homegrown American in the room. How do you see it?
Yes, the amount of foreign coverage of anything in the US is minimal, but I still believe that Americans see Britain as not only a peer country, but the country that is the most similar to them. And I stand by my analysis that if an American was asked, do people have a more similar lifestyle in Canada or Australia or Britain, they would say, yes, Canada and Australia, they live more similarly to us, quote unquote. But then if they were asked, whose election do you care about, or what's the country that's economy and position in the world is most similar to ours, they would say Britain. So it hasn't reverberated yet, but what I assert is that once Keir is in office and he's doing more ordering than Sunak, it will cut through. In other words, once he goes to the NATO summit in Washington and he's physically in the same screenshot as Biden, it's going to cut through. And that once he makes certain comments on Anglo-American economic and geostrategic partnerships, boom, then it's happening. There's going to be a delayed effect here. What I think is worth discussing is the state of the special relationship. Before I jump into my theories on this, Alex, you are the one who has worked on Anglo-American relations from the inside. So how do you see whether Starmer or Sunak wins, and then whether Trump or Biden wins? Whither do you see the special relationship going from a economic, geostrategic perspective on things like coordination in Ukraine or over Gaza or on tariffs towards Chinese EVs or Huawei issues? How do you see the major issues playing out?
If it's Starmer, Biden, I think it's going to be a solid, straightforward, easy relationship. Their viewpoints are going to align. It's going to be very easy for them to work together. Starmer has gone and David Lammy have been absolutely crystal clear on their rock-solid support for Ukraine and their rock-solid commitment to NATO and to the nuclear deterrent. If it's Starmer and Trump, it's going to be a totally different ball game because Labour has sketched out its foreign policy as being called progressive realism, which means hard-headed national interests with a nod to human rights and international law. And that is not going to align with Trump's worldview, which is much more hard-headed. And I think we'll be in for a very rocky ride, and that will push Starmer to be trying to work much more closely with Europeans. If Farage does well, Farage-Trump and Farage could be a real thorn in the side of any Starmer-led administration. And then you have Farage in the House of Commons, and Trump will, if he visits the UK, he'll hang out with Nigel Farage, he will invite Nigel Farage to the US, and that will be, so Farage's presence in the House of Commons will be a very disruptive factor. I think the only issue where I feel the UK is going to struggle, even with a Biden administration and a Starmer premiership, is this issue of defence. I just feel Starmer's commitment that they will commit to 2.5% defence spending when circumstances allow. Given the security environment we're in, I just don't feel that's enough. And a lot of Americans are going to be worried about that, Democrat and Republican. There's just not enough commitment. And then on China, the David Lammy mantra is compete, cooperate, and challenge, which is a slight have your cake and eat it approach as well. And the Democrats are more hawkish on China than the current Labour Party position is. So those will be the two issues, I think, where there'll be difficulty.
I just want to amplify a few points that Alex brought up there, which is that the Trump-Starmer connection is going to be strained. Britain's PM would then be Trump's only fourth most favorite one in Europe. He's going to have great relations with Meloni. He'll be happy dealing with a Le Pen majority parliament in France. He will revert to his Drumpfianness in dealing with his ancestral homeland in Germany and dealing with the AfD there. So Starmer will be up against it in trying to cultivate a personal relationship with Trump. He hates Trump, that is. He hates lefty lawyers, and he doesn't like technocrats. He actually kind of despises people with working class backgrounds who are knowledgeable technocrats. So I think that when Starmer goes for those visits to Blair House, it is going to be really rocky, and we shouldn't underplay this. That said, Trump is an Anglophile. He loves his Scottish golf courses. He likes the monarchy. He feels that London gives him prestige when he can go there. He was very angry when he was booed when he was president, when he came to London. That hurt him. And he's going to be happy to come to the UK so that he can meet with Farage, especially if Farage has won in Clacton. And he's going to love the way in which a Trumpified Fox News can give a platform for Farage and other Reform Party ideas, and that those things can echo back and forth. I want to stress these echoings. When I think of where we're at now, this soundbiteization of the media, it actually allows more echoing within the language families, because someone puts out a TikTok, and if that TikTok is in French, it doesn't have any cut through in America. But if that TikTok is in a funny British accent, but about things like migration or taxes, it can cut through to the youth in America. And we just need to project back, which is that these things have been going on for a long time. Biden plagiarized Neil Kinnock's speech in his 1988 Democratic primary campaign. And I think in Biden's mind, he envisions himself as the American equivalent of a northern working class British labor leader. For him, Pennsylvania and Scranton are the equivalent of Lancashire and Newcastle. When he hears the word Kinnock or Keir, he thinks Biden. And therefore, the nature of that relationship, that Biden-Starmer duo, even though it's only going to be for a few months before the election, I think it's going to cause more of a synergy on Anglo-American policy towards Middle East, towards China, Taiwan, towards Ukraine. Yes, there are those issues that Alex, I think, expertly flagged, which is that the Democrats in the U.S. are always going to be more hawkish on China than a Labour Party in the U.K. because Britain wants to have trade with China and doesn't have the geopolitical heft to face it down. But I think the more that we can have the synergy of Keir and Biden, we're going to get a consensus policy that's going to throw out some of the positives of what global orderers working together will be, and that this is something that white, suburban, non-college educated males are going to grasp in places like Michigan and Minnesota. They don't have to have heard of who Keir is. It's merely that these messages of, hey, centrist leadership is actually getting stuff done. And so I remain hopeful about that.
I mean, I really hope you're right. I agree. There is something symbolic about a reestablishment of a kind of moderate centrist norm, and that if Starmer is elected, it gives a lie to the assumption that somehow the world is all drifting towards more populism and more extremism. So there will be a sort of a ripple effect of there is still this centrist international law centre is still holding. However, we also have a couple of other difficult issues coming up. One is that Starmer currently has it in his manifesto to recognise a Palestinian state, and it's possible that Starmer will choose to play it long and not rock the boat. But the Middle East issue is going to continue to be very difficult for both Biden and Starmer. We also have one of Starmer's very first international events will be the NATO summit in Washington, with very difficult policy decisions on Ukraine and Russia. France is going to be in a very difficult period of cohabitation.
And that's why, Alex, I think that Starmer will be so much more important on the international scene because Olaf Scholz has shit the bed, not only on Ukraine, but on the way he's handled the AfD. In Italy, Meloni is doing really well, but she's a neo-populist. She's not leading the free world. And Trudeau is mired in scandal. The Japanese economy is still in D or no growth, and their population is tanked. So I think that when Starmer comes in, he's really going to be able to say, I'm the leader of the free world. And therefore, if Trump tragically would get in, we're going to see a situation where Britain will be the voice of a anti-neo-populist, centrist coalition. And they're the only ones who can do it. Do you know what I mean? And no matter how bad the economy is here, and no matter how impossible it is to get car insurance, you're still going to need to see someone with his accent coming out of number 10 and saying, this is the aid package that we've agreed for Ukraine, or we're recognizing the state of Palestine, but we're still helping the Israelis in responding to the Hezbollah threat in this way or that way, because Trump is not going to be able to provide that leadership. It's going to have to come from Starmer.
I hadn't really fully thought that through. That's really interesting because I don't think Starmer wants to be an international statesman. He is very focused on British domestic issues, but you're right, events may thrust him into a situation where he becomes out of the G7 or the one of the more prominent figures for campaigning still for that moderate centre. So he may get thrust into it.
Well, as disorderly and ineffectual as this campaign has been, I hope you mega orderers out there, particularly those in the United Kingdom, have an orderly next few days and enjoy this festival of democracy and Independence Day that we are going to be celebrating on July 4th, because for me personally, I think it will be Independence from Neo-Populists Day, and I couldn't be more psyched. So if you want to check out more about this topic, you can follow the links in the show notes and subscribe to our Substack. As always, our producer has been George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. Hope you have an orderly and democratic week, meaning please remember to vote and bring your voter ID, because otherwise I will have put up with hearing all of these annoying remember to bring your voter ID ads on podcasts, and it won't even have had an impact. So please bring your voter ID, remember to vote. I don't love the whole multi-party democracy thing, but if you're one of these Plaid Cymru or SNP or even ALBA voters, I still love you, and I'm happy that you voted.